Today, the United States informed us they will be imposing 25% tariffs on Canadian exports to the United States and 10% on Canadian energy. A decision that, should they elect to proceed with, should take effect on Tuesday, February 4th.
What if I told you that the global economy isn't collapsing by accident, but by design? That behind every tariff, every trade war, and every supply chain breakdown, there's a coordinated plan to bring down the old system and replace it with something far more sinister? This isn't just about the US versus China or Europe versus America. This is about control. The elites at the World Economic Forum, alongside every major government, are engineering an economic reset where digital currencies, restricted trade, and AI-driven financial control will determine who thrives and who gets left behind. This isn't speculation. The 7 strategic moves to collapse the global economy. 7. The Arctic Gambit, the battle over Greenland's hidden wealth. Greenland isn't just ice. It's a geopolitical goldmine. Beneath the surface lie rare earth minerals, oil reserves, and new shipping routes that will become essential as supply chains break down. The Arctic is the next global control zone, and the WEF-controlled nations, China, Russia, the EU, and the US, are secretly dividing it up. Trump's so-called purchase attempt of Greenland wasn't a joke. It was a signal that the US was maneuvering for its pre-assigned slice of the Arctic pie. Denmark and the EU pretended to resist, but behind the scenes, they've been reinforcing their military presence to ensure that only WEF-approved actors can access these resources. Meanwhile, China and Russia have disguised their infiltration as research stations, placing military infrastructure in key locations. And the US? It plays dumb publicly, but has already negotiated agreements to split future profits. 6. The Tariff Rebellion, a carefully scripted economic crisis. We were sold the idea that tariffs were a way to protect American industry. But what if they were the exact opposite? The US government, under WEF influence, imposed tariffs knowing full well they would spark retaliatory measures, ensuring a manufactured supply chain collapse. This wasn't about hurting China or Europe. It was about destabilizing production lines worldwide, so that industries would be forced to consolidate under centralized control. Every major nation pretended to fight back with their own counter-tariffs. But the truth? They were all coordinating their moves to systematically disrupt trade networks. The goal is to make traditional production and distribution completely unreliable, forcing businesses to accept new WEF-approved digital commerce systems. And let's be clear, the US is not a victim. It's playing its role perfectly. American policymakers knew these tariffs would weaken domestic production, but they enacted them anyway, because when the collapse is final, they'll be the ones presenting the solution. 5. Canada's role. Trudeau's full submission to the WEF plan. Trudeau isn't an independent leader. He's a hand-picked WEF operative, executing a strategy to dismantle Canada's independence and integrate it fully into the global system. The moment the US imposed tariffs, Canada immediately pivoted to the EU and China, not as a reaction, but as a pre-planned move to sever North America's economic unity. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, wasn't just a trade deal. It was a restructuring of Canada's economic identity. The real objective? Weaken ties with the US while strengthening connections with WEF-aligned nations. But make no mistake, Washington knew this would happen. They played their part, allowing Canada to break away, so they could use it as a regional control center for the new order, enforcing digital trade policies before they roll out in the US. Every step Trudeau has taken has been scripted by the elites. The real question? Why did the US let it happen? Because it's part of a larger game plan where economic alliances are shifting to support the rise of a centralized global governing body. The 7 strategic moves to collapse the global economy. 4. The EU's power play, orchestrating the death of US influence. The European Union isn't just reacting to tariffs. It's executing a long-term economic coup. For decades, the EU has relied on American military and economic dominance. But the WEF has decided that the US must be strategically weakened to make way for a more centralized, European-led financial order. The EU's rapid formation of trade agreements with Japan, Mexico, and South America wasn't about economic survival. It was about deliberately cutting the US out of global commerce. Every agreement signed was a strategic move to ensure Europe remains dominant as the new financial system emerges. But here's the key: the US allowed this to happen. The so-called trade wars and tariffs were nothing more than distractions, while European leadership coordinated with WEF policymakers to expand regional economic control over Western markets. Washington could have countered these moves, but they didn't, because they're not losing the game, they're playing their role. By allowing the EU to forge economic alliances outside of American control, they're ensuring that when the financial collapse happens, the US dollar will lose its status as the global reserve currency. The final goal? A financial restructuring where European economic institutions take precedence over Wall Street and American banks. The euro is already being positioned as the next dominant world currency, and once the shift is complete, the United States will no longer dictate global trade policy. It will follow orders. 3. Mexico's escape plan, a nation switching allegiances. Mexico has long been seen as an economic extension of the US. But the second tariffs hit? Mexico immediately turned to the EU and China, locking in massive new trade agreements that intentionally bypassed the US. And let's not forget, Mexico is a full WEF participant. This was never about self-preservation. 2. The US-Europe rift, the controlled demolition of an alliance. The US and Europe were once inseparable. The Marshall Plan, NATO, Cold War unity. But now, the alliance is crumbling by design. For decades, the transatlantic relationship was based on economic cooperation, but the WEF has rewritten the rules. The US and Europe are no longer allies. They're competitors in a staged economic war where the goal is controlled collapse. This is how the process was executed. Step 1. The US imposed tariffs on European goods, pushing Europe to seek alternative markets. Step 2. The EU signed trade agreements with Asian and Latin American nations, cutting the US out of its supply chains. The US retaliated with more sanctions and economic restrictions, accelerating the divide. 1. The new global order, the endgame is here. Look at the pattern. Every trade war, every tariff, every broken alliance. It all leads to one unavoidable conclusion. The world economy is being deliberately dismantled to make way for the new world order. And here's the final move. Once the current economic system fully collapses, world leaders will introduce the solution: a digital global currency, centralized banking under a global authority, and economic tracking mechanisms that will determine who can and cannot participate in trade. The US won't just be affected, it will be integrated into this new system without resistance. The Federal Reserve, Wall Street, and the White House are already on board with the transition. And if you think this is speculation, just look at the recent policies rolling out worldwide. CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, are already being introduced as a solution to financial instability. Carbon credit-based financial transactions are being discussed openly as a replacement for cash-based economies. Digital ID systems are being implemented to track all financial activity under the guise of security and regulation. The only question left is, will people wake up before it's too late? Because if we don't push back now, we may never have another chance. Final verdict. The WEF's coup is almost complete. This isn't about fixing trade. This isn't about economics. This is about total control. The pieces are already in place. The US isn't resisting this change, it's facilitating it. Washington, the Federal Reserve, Wall Street, they're all in on it. And once the collapse is finalized, there will be no turning back. What happens next? Will the US finally drop the facade and fully embrace WEF policies? Or will public resistance force them to accelerate their agenda before people wake up? Let me know in the comments. Do you see what's happening, or are people still blind to the truth? And if you want more hard-hitting reality, subscribe now. Because trust me, they do not want this information getting out. Stay awake, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next On.